Good morning and welcome to this edition of Community Matters, public service program produced and presented by this iHeartRadio station. I certainly hope that your weekend is going well and wishing you a very, very happy Sunday morning. I'm Rick Hamada. This coming Wednesday, well, just a few days away, it will be the opening day of the 2024 legislative session. And to help us understand what is in store for this upcoming session, we have Ted Kefalas with Grassroots Institute. And Ted, I want to thank you for taking time this morning, and aloha as well.
Hey, aloha, Rick. Thank you so much for having me, as always. Really love our conversations and look forward to getting into everything with you today.
Full disclosure, Grassroots Institute joins me on my morning program on News Radio 830 KHVH Thursdays at 8:40 in the morning. You can join us there on a regular basis. For our friends on our other iHeartRadio stations, like to get to know Ted a little bit better. Would you mind some background on yourself, Ted?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work as the Director of Strategic Campaigns for a local nonprofit think tank based here in Honolulu called the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii. And if you haven't heard of us, we really are focused on lowering the cost of living and holding the government accountable. So I have been with Grassroots for about a little over 3 years now and have really loved my time there because I really feel like we're trying to make a difference. And all too often we hear from folks that say, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and they don't necessarily follow through. But part of my job is trying to get the legislators to follow through, get our elected officials to actually look at ways to lower the cost of living and make sure that they are transparent in what they're doing. Like I said, came to Grassroots about 3 years ago. I came from Virginia and around D.C. I worked as a lobbyist up there and worked for congressmen up there. So really, Hawaii has been very welcoming, and I can't say thank you enough. And to all the people that I've met here and have welcomed me with open arms has really allowed me to get a lay of the land and understand some of the problems that most everyday people are facing.
Can you do help us with a compare and contrast geographically? The issues that you've discovered that we have here in Hawaii, are there similarities in other areas as well?
Oh yeah, I think we can draw a lot of similarities, especially when it comes to the housing crisis. I mean, you look at what's going on in the mainland, and they're dealing with a lot of the same issues. But I will say, just the openness and the accessibility of legislators really here is very different than what it is in D.C. Here, oftentimes, you can call up an office, you can write an email, and a lot of times you can get a personal response back from folks. Versus, Washington, D.C., a lot of people, they're hiding behind multiple layers of bureaucracy and staff members and whatnot. So it really has been a great opportunity to come out here and meet with folks and talk through some of the issues. But to back to your question, there are a lot of those same similarities when it comes to the housing issue, when it comes to taxation in a lot of states, when it comes to licensing. A lot of people are finding it hard to just become a licensed professional, regardless of what it is, whether it's healthcare industry or in the construction industry or whatnot. So there's a lot of similarities, but of course here we feel it a lot more because we're such a small island, and a lot of those things are amplified.
So it's interesting because we here in Hawaii, by numerous organizations, publications, and more, we're cited consistently being the most unfriendly business state in the country. And there's a myriad of quotients as to why. We have been ranked recently #1 in homelessness per capita in the country. We are ranked near the bottom of the list when there's quality of public education that is being examined. We tend to do well in high rankings in these areas of not so good. Whenever I check, #1, health, attributable to an active lifestyle, which is in relation to where we live. I mean, I can understand that. So why is it that we have all of these issues that we may have similarities, but we tend to have the most in challenges?
Well, I think, especially when we look at the housing issue, because we're on a rock in the middle of the water, we really don't have a ton of room to expand. And you also have to look at the current land use situation, where only 5% of our land is currently allowed for residential use. The rest is either agriculture or conservation. And so essentially what that means is we can only build on 5% of the land here in Hawaii. Well, we're already limited to what, we're on this island, we can only build but so much, but then we put this artificial limiter in that says we're stuck at 5%. And I'm not saying to pave over paradise, right? But at a certain point, we have to kind of reassess what's important to us. And the difference between 45% conservation land and 44%, I don't know that many people are going to notice it. But if we open up thousands of acres now for housing, well, that's a huge difference. And I recognize that a lot of people maybe have issues with, any kind of redevelopment of ag land or conservation land. And so that's why one of our proposals is actually to increase housing density on land that's already residential. So we're talking small homes and small lots. And we can get into that later, but I think, again, on the housing issue, we're just constrained by space, and we put these artificial limits in. The other thing, when you look at, like, licensing, for example, we license the most amount of professions out of any state in the country. And so what that does is it makes it more difficult for someone just starting in the industry to get their license and actually start practicing, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a nurse, whether it's a plumber, someone else in the construction industry.
Or a makeup artist.
Exactly.
It's amazing.
We license so many people, and the requirements for those licenses sometimes are so out of whack with reality that it really makes it unrealistic for professionals to be here. So that's why you see so many people leaving Hawaii. That's why you see, not a ton of people. We may feel like we have a ton of outside influence coming in, but the numbers don't back that up, and we've had consistent population decline year after year. And so we have to look at ways to make it more friendly to do business here and more friendly to live here and raise your kids here. And so, there's a whole host of things that I think legislators can do, and we're hopeful that they'll at least have an eye towards that this year, especially with the election season coming up here in 2024.
I know we're going to delve into the session, but I'm really happy to get a perspective on some of the thoughts that many may have top of mind. The uniqueness of Hawaii, not only geography, but obviously its culture. And I'm going to just get your take on, as a former kingdom with a history that just beginning in 1893 and moving forward through various times in that chronology, what influences or what poses even greater challenge in rectifying some of the issues that we may have in more generic cultural states?
Well, and that's a difficult question. I think, because Hawaii is still, one of the most recent state, there's still a lot that is being figured out.
And that's what I'm fearful of. We'll have this self-assurance that people will always come, will always have an excess of visitors. One of the most competitive industries, it won't take long for people to choose others.
Yeah, and part of the problem, too, is you want to strike that balance, right? But at the same time, if you swing too far in the direction of taxing everybody to the point where they're not coming anymore, well, all of a sudden, they aren't going to come anymore, and it's going to be too late. And you're going to have all the folks in the hotel industry that are going to be losing their jobs because of it, because they're not going to have visitors to kind of foot the bill anymore. And so, again, we as a state have to recognize that and look for different ways to diversify our economy. I know everybody always says this, right? Diversify the economy. We hear it every election season, and you're going to hear it a lot in November. But it is that, and it's not necessarily farming. There's other ways to look at our economy. We can look to the technology sector. We can look to different hydroponics. There's different ways that we can utilize our expertise and our strategic advantage here in Hawaii to become a leader in a certain industry. But unfortunately, a lot of people have that eye towards farming and ag, and not saying that that's not going to happen. It's not a good way forward, but I mean, look at the farms; they're all sitting fallow, unfortunately, and so it's so expensive. Hawaii's current regulations make it so expensive to do business here, as we mentioned, whether it's to pay for workers to work on the farms, whether it's shipping things out to the mainland or to foreign countries. It just becomes so expensive that it's not realistic anymore, and that's why, unfortunately, we don't have any more farms.
And conversely, we have in our annual budget allocations for certain departments, etc. Even the lieutenant governor's office has a stipend, and out of all the departments in the state, the Department of Agriculture receives the absolute lowest percentile of general budget allocation. However, we're being told that we import 95 to 98% of our food, which allows for an incredible cost of living percentile that helps drive people out because it's just too doggone expensive. So it's interesting, that mixed message. We need to be sustainable. We need to have our own food sources and not be reliant, but we're not going to invest in any way, but we'll retain the land valuation.
Right.
And that is a commingling that if more people really grasped that, I think there would be a much vocal constituency.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's kind of to your point, speaking out of both sides of your mouth, where you say, we want to prioritize ag, and we're going to keep all of our lands for ag, but at the same time, we're not going to spend any money on agriculture, and too bad, so sad, hopefully it works out. Well, that's not necessarily a formula for success, and it seems like, as is often the case in government, whether it's in Hawaii or on the mainland, but there's multiple departments, I think, that are just not synced up. And so that's when you end up with this kind of, policy that talks out of both sides of their mouth, like I said.
But then again, and talking with Ted Grassroots Institute, there seems those that are in the status quo will justify whatever their decisions are because of a virtual political mandate. And that with the Democratic majority, and that with decades and decades of service by some in positions of enhanced power and authority. Can you explain to us what the political landscape truly is here in our state, and then, citing the vast majority of one party, how that can prove to be beneficial or detrimental in light of another legislative session on the horizon?
Yeah, and I will give you a very political answer to that, Rick. I think there's pros and cons to the system that we currently have and the political breakdown that we have. As everybody knows, I mean, we're in a state that is, as you mentioned, dominated by the Democratic Party. And whether that's for better or for worse can be debated, but some of the cons of that really come from the lack of debate and lack of external kind of discussion and thought, really. I mean, all too often there's kind of a one-track piece of mind, and really one of the things that I've noticed from both parties, Republican and Democrat here in Hawaii, is they are starting increasingly to take their cues from the National Party. And so a lot of times you'll see this sort of rhetoric that we see in D.C., that it's targeting specific individuals and whatnot, trying to raise donation funds. But there's, again, downsides to the lack of debate, lack of discussion amongst members, because a lot of times everything that happens on the floor happens actually in caucus. Behind closed doors, there is really very limited debate on the floor of the House or the Senate. And so it's something that, can really lack transparency for folks that are just trying to find answers about what's happening at the legislature. At the same time, though, there is opportunity with a fully, supermajority, essentially, if you will, where they can pass legislation. They're not locked in gridlock that you see in D.C. or certain other states that are more purple in nature, where you have one side Republican, one side Democrat, and the House will pass something, but the Senate says no. So a lot of times legislators will be on the same page here. But one thing too that I've also noticed about the Democratic Party as a whole is that there are multiple faces to the party. You have a lot of the blue dog centrist Democrats that are budget focused, looking at ways to solve the crisis when it comes to the cost of living here, when it comes to lowering taxes but maintaining certain amounts of services here. You also have the progressives, right? And they're the environmentally cautious, environmentally friendly, if you will, folks that are really pushing some of those more progressive policies from the mainland, actually. And so, it can be difficult for I'm sure, the party to kind of keep those two in check when it comes to those different faces. But at the same time, a lot of times those discussions happen behind closed doors because they are part of the Democratic Party. And, the public, like you and me, are not privy to those things.
Right. It is this edition of Community Matters, produced and presented by this iHeart radio station. Good man, good friend. He is Ted Kefalas of Grassroots Institute, and my name is Rick Hamada. Before we get back into topicality, share a little bit more about Grassroots Institute. How can we connect, support, and anything else you'd like to share, Ted?
Yeah, so again, Grassroots Institute, we are a completely independent local think tank. We are not supported by any political party, any government, anything like that. All of our revenue comes from local people. And so we are so proud to represent all of our folks and supporters down at the legislature and at the county councils and whatnot. But really, again, we're trying to look at lowering the cost of living, holding government accountable and transparent. And so if that's something that you can get behind, you can go on our website. It's grassrootinstitute.org, and it's .org, not .com. A lot of people will confuse those. But you can also follow us for up to the minute information and updates. You can follow us on Instagram and our YouTube channel as well. So we do a lot of entertaining type things. We try to keep folks engaged. It really, a lot of times policy can be boring. And, it takes a certain kind of person, a certain kind of nerd to be interested in this kind of stuff. So we try to break it down as simple as possible, help people understand what's actually happening at the legislature, and digest what's happening so that they can actually take action and get involved. So again, if that's something that interests you, you can visit us on our website, sign up for our newsletter. It's grassrootinstitute.org.
So I'm going to invoke a four-letter word, which is supposedly against FCC policy. And that word is budget. Well, it's close to four letters because, Ted, this is just astonishing. Could you briefly put in perspective what the financial situation has been from 2019 pre-COVID, during and after, and where we are today with monies, their status, expenditures, encumbrance, whatever it might be, to give us a true picture of our state budget?
Sure. Well, I'll kind of start with the kind of COVID and all of the federal money. If you remember, we were, just kind of had a shot in the arm of federal cash, and it almost seemed like we didn't know what to do with. And so legislators at the beginning were saying, oh my gosh, COVID's hitting, we need to shut down, and we saw a lot of dips in our revenue. But then we got that shot of the federal money. It's shot back up, and we had surpluses in the billions of dollars, and that's a lot of zeros. It's billions with a B.
That's right.
So, that's something where a lot of legislators back last year, or actually 2 years ago, it was election season, if you remember. Again, I harp on election season because that is the main thing that legislators are thinking. How can I keep this seat, and how can I continue being a representative or a senator or city councilman, what have you? So they took that money, spent a bunch of it in their districts to try to show to their voters that, oh, yeah, look at what I did. I created this park. I did this, that, or the other. And, oops, all that surplus is gone. So we're looking at it like, all of these things that legislators have, given money to, whether it's the new Aloha Stadium, whether it's the rail, all of these things add up. And so we have to be smart about it. And unfortunately, like I said, all of that surplus went away. We were looking at downgraded years where we were looking at down revenues, actually, for this year, and potentially a shortfall. Luckily, the Council of Revenues just met recently. They found another $250 million.
Amazing.
Somehow, I don't know where they find this money, right?
I don't know. They must have a very large sofa to go under the cushions.
And so, it kind of went, to sum it up, like a bit of a roller coaster, up and down and up and down and up and down. And so now, luckily and hopefully, we can stay at that up portion. But I don't have the most confidence, Rick, unfortunately, and I wouldn't be surprised if next year we're having a down portion and they're looking at trying to increase revenues again.
I know, because you mentioned early in the conversation of tax hikes, and it's just simply astounding with all of this revenue. This upcoming session, of course, you mentioned Lahaina. I sense that there are going to be a myriad of different spending bills that are going to include Lahaina, recovery, combination, or more. But I'm concerned, as we were with private sector donations and disbursements, of the accuracy in the accounting and the destination, receipt of those revenues. How can we track them when we hear another 28 million, 14 million, 117, whatever the degrees are? How can we make sure the accounting is sound?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I think that's something that we will certainly have to look into as a state and as a community, because you're exactly right. I mean, there is an outpouring of what seems like community support, but then you see the people, like I mentioned, on Kaanapali Beach that are still struggling and still don't have housing and still really don't have any answers. And so I think that is something that, and I would be surprised if the legislature does any sort of audit this year. But I wouldn't be surprised if it comes in the following sessions, just because that is an important issue, and it's something that, again, there's hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially billions of dollars that are flooding into that area, but yet where is it? And you see these folks that really don't seem like they're getting a dime.
Exactly. Very, very much so. Great concern. And boy, time is flying by for us here. Ted Kefalas with the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii. If we could take on another tack with the opening day of legislation, and just briefly, on the one hand we hear Maui, the other hand we hear legalization or decriminalization of marijuana for recreational use. What's your take with Grassroots on this initiative? We assume that it's going to pass finally after many, many years. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe our state attorney general had actually opined that there is support for this next step. And what is the impact to us here at home?
Well, and we really have not gotten too involved in the recreational marijuana issue in the past. And I do think that you mentioned the Attorney General's support, and I do think it should be qualified where I'm not sure that they gave their necessarily rah-rah cheerleader support for it. But, it is something that could potentially increase revenue for the state, and it's something where you wouldn't have to look to tax residents. But, we do have to look to other states that have done this stuff before, whether it's Colorado, California, and look to see how their program is working, what can be done better. A lot of times, though, you still see that there's an illicit black market out there for these things, and so what can we learn from these places? We don't have to reinvent the wheel if we choose to go this route, and try to put our best foot forward and actually see what is going to be beneficial for local people.
I want to thank Ted Kefalas so very much. Ted, if we want to connect with Grassroots, what's the best way?
Yeah, you can visit us online at grassrootsinstitute.org. You can sign up for our weekly newsletters that come out every Friday, and we also have a President's Corner from our president, Dr. Keli'i Akina, who is a member of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, but he is also our CEO and does the two separately. But you can subscribe to our newsletters, and that way you can also join us on Instagram, YouTube, and get up-to-the-minute information, see all of our kind of funny memes about different legislation, and stay up to date that way so you can get involved.
And once again, thanking Ted very much with Grassroots for joining us on this edition of Community Matters. Ted will reach out again and have another discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Appreciate it.
And you can always join us at this time with Community Matters My name is Rick Hamada. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and as always, remember your community matters. Aloha.